Okay, I think we're ready to get started here. I'm Hannah Racky. I am the Director of Product here at LabKey. LabKey has over 20 years of institutional experience solving data management problems for a wide variety of research science organizations. And usually folks come to us in a variety of states of organization and preparedness when they're looking to implement a new data management system. And so our job is really to help get aligned and to help guide them through this process and implementation and getting them up and running with the software. And so this allows us to have a pretty good insight into how folks are preparing for a new LIMS software, as well as some sort of experience on our side of what we've seen has been really successful for organizations in terms of preparedness and in that evaluation. So we'll get into this in 1 minute, but just in terms of logistics, we are recording this presentation and we'll send it to you a few days after it's done being recorded here, as well as if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or comment in the chat. There's going to be a few sort of interactive polls, so just kind of be aware and ready for those. So in addition to working as a product manager here at LabKey, I also was a bench scientist for about 10 years. And before this, in my previous life, I've kind of worked at a variety of different organizations with a variety of different tools or lack of tools. So certainly have worked in academic spaces that really have had no formal tracking, not even any sort of guidelines around data capture in a notebook or on paper or anything like that, to a much more regulated translational lab where we were sort of collecting samples from clinical trials and doing research on those. So a wide breadth of personal experience as well as sort of the experience of working with clients here at LabKey. And so maybe to get started, I think this is a pretty interesting question to ask folks of what is a LIMS to you? And so if you want to start putting things in the chat and telling me what a LIMS is for you, we'll kind of start there because I think it's really interesting to kind of see how many different perspectives folks have on LIMS software. And so I'll start by adding something into the chat here. That LIMS is a tool to help manage lab data. Perfect. It's for sample management and data capture. Excellent. A way to keep track of your data and results, notebooks that everyone shares. Yeah, absolutely. Data and sample management. Perfect. Yeah. So all of these things I think are really aligned, and actually much more heterogeneous than I thought. So that's very exciting to see. When I look at Wikipedia says that a LIMS is a software-based solution that helps support a modern lab's operations. And so that I think is a very, very general picture of what a LIMS is, and certainly aligns with kind of what we've heard from people in the past about what a LIMS is. But I think kind of based on the chats here, as well as using generative AI to get a little bit more specific in our answer, a laboratory information management system is a software solution that helps streamline, automate, and manage those laboratory operations. We see sample tracking here and data management, these other pieces that other folks brought up here in the chat. So that's great. And really, that's what we're going to be talking about today is sort of the software that helps you perform your work in the lab, as well as maintain compliance and security and things like that. Oh, that's good to know, Jason. I didn't realize I was only going to the panelists. We'll have to share those. And then a little history of a LIMS of like, how did we get here kind of in 2025 now with this type of system? Back in the 60s and 70s, there were sort of LIMS tools that were used by large-scale organizations like government organizations and other sort of big pharma companies and industrial labs that had sort of these mainframe-based lab data management systems. Um, and then kind of a decade or two later, you start to see more sort of PC-based LIMS that had a graphical user interface, as well as was trying to attempt to track more data from instruments. And that's where really people started to use this more in like environmental testing labs and R&D labs, as well as some like clinical research organizations and biotech companies. And so really it starts to sort of expand as obviously, computers become more ubiquitous as well. And then as we look kind of more towards our present state, a lot of groups are using LIMS to help drive AI or machine learning, or having things like configurable workflows or real-time analytics, with a special emphasis on security measures, especially as a lot of these tools go more into the cloud. And we start to see smaller and academic organizations also picking up LIMS. And I think the history of LIMS has really aligned well with the history of scientific advancement and the technology that has come with science as well, right? As we have more and more data to manage or more and more experiments that are high throughput, it becomes much more important to be in line with protocols as well as ensuring that we can have the output that's necessary in this day and age in order to get funding or get IRB approval or sort of get ahead in our respective industries. And so really, now that we've talked about sort of what a LIMS is, what are ways that LIMS can help support your laboratory? And oftentimes people are looking for a LIMS to help improve efficiency in the lab. And so this can come in a variety of ways where folks are just looking to increase output overall and make sure that that consistency is being upheld throughout their laboratory work, as well as sort of looking to reduce manual errors and improve that data accuracy. So manual errors, when caught, require that folks redo experiments or recheck their work or go back and sort of make those modifications. When they're not caught, it can cause much larger, more dramatic problems within the laboratory. So really trying to minimize those as much as possible, as well as then also making sure that it's easy to find materials or data within the lab. So when you're not using a LIMS or a centralized data management system, oftentimes it will take days to locate samples in the freezer, or it will take days to go back and look at an experiment that somebody ran 2 years ago that may have already left the lab, and trying to understand, what raw data was collected for maybe the analyzed data that somebody's looking at the moment. Data management and analysis. So this was a big thing that people sort of shared as what they want a LIMS to do for them. And this allows really for that high traceability of samples and data. So if I'm holding a sample in the lab, I'm able to identify where it came from, any sort of abnormalities or other metadata around that would be pertinent for my experiment. And anything like that with other data as well. So again, if I'm looking at sort of a bunch of analyzed results, am I able to go back and look at that raw data and understand why something might be different than what I expect? Or if there's an outlier or an abnormality, I'm able to sort of interrogate that much more easily in a data management system. Standardized data views really help folks with more daily work, like, regular reporting, maybe it's daily, weekly, monthly type thing, as well as feeding data into downstream applications. which can include things like machine learning and AI, but also just downstream applications for further analysis or even generation of papers or submissions or things like that. And then the last one here is having that centralized source of truth for data. So as labs get larger or start collecting more and more data, sometimes a very common story we'll hear is, there's data in this drive and on this computer and in this central location. Maybe sometimes there's like a Dropbox or a Teams or something where all of this data is. It becomes very arduous to find and locate that information when it's needed. Scalability and collaboration is another reason why people look for a LIMS. So as they become larger labs or as the organization grows and expands, needing that ability to have sort of that cross-functional data accessibility and being able to hand that off between teams becomes very important. And then also, again, having that central location where everything can live, so you're not having to go in and individually search different drives or things like that. And then lastly, of course, I think most of us have some sort of compliance and security standards that we're trying to uphold. Maintenance of audit trails is one thing, or having sort of role-based access to the electronic data that you're capturing as well. So making sure that the system that you have is also helping you abide by any regulations that you're following within your organization. And so now we get kind of into the meat of it, right? Where there's really three main steps that we found to evaluate LIMS software. The first thing is all preparatory work. So what you want to do is really identify and gather the requirements that you're looking for in a LIMS. And the more effort that you spend here, the easier everything else downstream will come, and we'll talk about kind of what those requirements are. And then the second step is really that evaluation and shortlisting. So once you have identified exactly what you want your LIMS to do for you, it becomes very easy to then search for vendors and look for LIMS options that will help you solve those needs. And then getting demos and having that kind of iteration. And then lastly, we really want to emphasize the importance of doing an in-depth evaluation and making that selection. And so without an in-depth evaluation, I think it's sometimes labs will then struggle getting implemented because they're going back to that gathering requirements stage to help implement, after they've chosen a vendor. So having that evaluation can be very helpful in that process, as well as making your selection, obviously, of a LIMS vendor as well. And so I've got a quick poll here, and really just curious where everybody is right now in the process of evaluating LIMS software. And this could be like not evaluating LIMS software, just curious kind of to hear about LIMS, or maybe some people are much further down sort of that stage where they're already in a deep dive. So be interested to see kind of what folks look like. Yeah, so it looks like most folks are just getting started or sort of just curious. And so I think this is a really this is a good time to join this type of webinar. So that's great to sort of see what that looks like. And so let's start with kind of the gathering requirements stage here. And so there's a lot of questions that you're going to be wanting to sort of ask yourself and ask your lab during this time. And I think the biggest, most important one is, what are the pain points that your lab is experiencing? And really getting those documented, as well as getting everybody's buy-in, right? So I've definitely been in labs before where I think something's a problem, but it's really just, a problem with my workflow, not anything anybody else is experiencing. And so really making sure that everybody is aligned on what are the key reasons, why we're looking for LIMS and what we want that LIMS to do. as well as sort of prioritizing those pain points, I think can also be really helpful. Oftentimes you'll see people describe these things as a must-have or a nice to have, to help indicate, what is sort of that line that we're willing to jump over at some point. What are those key objectives for implementing a LIMS? So, are you looking to improve your efficiency or maintain or uphold compliance within the lab? Are you trying to work with automation or getting, more steps within the process automated? So maybe you don't have to hire someone, or somebody's leaving and you won't have the budget to sort of backfill that position. Um, and another really good question sort of during this phase is to think about if you've used a LIMS before, or if really anybody in your lab or organization that's sort of adjacent to you has used a LIMS before. And if so, what are those strengths and weaknesses, and what are things that might be good to look for in this phase of the evaluation as well? The fourth question here, I think, really comes more about if lab efficiency is a big pain point, but oftentimes it's also good to think about, maybe it's just a benefit. It's not really a pain point that you're looking to solve. Is the LIMS going to help improve lab efficiency, and can it help improve that accuracy? And what are the things that your lab would look for when you're doing that? And again, kind of having these things written down, having them prioritized, having sort of the buy-in from everybody in the lab, I think can be really helpful. And then really sort of the logistics piece, just so everybody's on the same page, understanding what that budget is, as well as if there's a desired timeline for deployment. So oftentimes we'll ask people, what their timeline is, mostly to understand if there's a goal that somebody's working towards that we can help them fulfill. And so when you have a timeline, it can help establish, the right checkpoints for each of these phases, as you have chosen a vendor, what that implementation process will look like as well. So these are kind of the general questions to start with. As you're looking at some of those pain points in your lab, there's going to be some other sort of more specific things that you're going to want to ask yourself, your lab, as you're sort of undergoing this process. So around that workflow management piece, so making sure that you have a good idea of how the LIMS will capture and automate your lab's workflows to help improve that efficiency and eliminate any bottlenecks that you're experiencing. If you have a lot of requirements around sample management, which it looks like many folks did based on kind of their description of a LIMS, really making sure that you're documenting what are those requirements, what are the processes that you're doing now to track or process or store your samples, and will the LIMS be able to do that, or even do that better than what you guys are doing today? The anything around sort of data and reporting questions like what types of data are you generating, and what is the data that you want that LIMS to support, as well as what types of reports you'd want the LIMS to generate. So this again often comes in sort of that hierarchy or prioritized list of things that people are looking to do within the system. Are there any system integrations that need to happen within your lab? Do you have outside tools like lab instruments or other databases such as EMRs or EDCs or anything that it captures legacy data that you'd want to integrate with? Do you have any external systems? We often get people asking us about billing modules or connecting with other billing tools for their finance department. So really having that holistic list of what you want your LIMS to do is also a really good starting point. Compliance and security. So really thinking about, I think first and foremost, what are the regulations that you're following now? And do you need that system to follow any other regulations? Oftentimes, some people will come to us and say, we're looking to be CLIA or other type of certification and trying to maintain that using a software tool. Customization and scalability. So really thinking about your lab and how flexible the LIMS might need to be in order to sort of capture what you're doing now, as well as what you might be doing in 6 months or a year from now or 5 years from now. Usually people don't want to implement more than one LIMS in their lifetime. So going through and really trying to find something that's going to future-proof the lab it is good for that longevity of the software over time. And then lastly, really thinking about what types of training or documentation or other training tools that your lab may want from a vendor to help support your team. So if you have a lot of very technically savvy, maybe either bioinformaticians or developers or things like that on the team, there might be a lot of different needs that come from training that type of team rather than sort of a typical bench scientist who's really focused on, non-computer aspects of their job for the most part. So after you've kind of gone through that gathering requirements phase, it's also really important to do your due diligence in terms of sort of preparing for that evaluation. And this is something that we see time and time again with folks of maybe not having done this due diligence, and then really, the process of evaluation takes a lot longer, or there can be speed bumps along the way because they didn't get that sort of initial buy-in. So making sure that you have that selection criteria, those requirements gathering phase. But then also making sure that you're talking to leadership, your PI, CSO, CTO, those types of folks around what those needs are, what budget you may have projected for this, and any other resource availability. So some LIMS will really require somebody to be sort of full-time in that management of the system, and other LIMS may not. So understanding kind of what your resources are to help select vendors will be useful there. Making sure you're talking to IT or security teams about any requirements that the organization has on what your software can be ahead of time. They also may have institutionally preferred vendors. So this happens very frequently as well, where people are experienced in one LIMS already, and so they'd really prefer labs to pick up the LIMS kind of that they prefer. And then making sure that you're also establishing who are the decision makers for this. It is very important to get all of the lab sort of buy-in for the software, but ultimately, I think this works a little bit better as like less of a democracy and more of sort of a hierarchy in decision making of we really need, 4 people that span sort of functional teams to be able to select this on behalf of the team. And so sort of having somebody elected to do that will help make the process smoother and definitely helps with that prioritization aspect of the requirements gathering as well. Because when everything's a high priority, sort of nothing becomes a high priority to fix, right? So I think it can really sort of dilute the requirements that you've put together if you don't have kind of that decision-making process in mind. And then also, making sure that you're aligned on what that timing is and what that implementation may look like or what resources you may need during that implementation. Once you have done all of this homework, which is a lot of homework, I will say. But again, I think the more time you spend in this, the better your return is going to be when you start to look at vendors, and you'll have a quicker time and a much easier time establishing sort of that short list and then getting into that deep evaluation as well. So once you have this and you start to reach out to vendors, there's also going to be a little bit of homework that comes with those discussions as well. So oftentimes vendors will ask for real world data of what does this look like and how can we help model that data within your lab. Um, Making sure that you have a defined process about what type of support that you want and who will be sort of the main contact for the vendors. Understanding kind of the scope of the LIMS. Is this a lab decision, a department decision, an org-wide decision? Who basically will be using the product? Understanding what your users' flexibility are and their openness to change. And this is something you may not share directly with the vendor, but ultimately good for you to know about what type of sort of activation energy might you or the vendor need to do to really get people on board with using a new system, because change is hard for all of us. And so how can we help minimize that challenge as much as possible? Thinking about sort of those biggest pain points and the time sinks, I think really that's kind of the high priority items from your requirements, and then also thinking about what are those future projections, plans, and growth to think about, is this system going to be able to sustain or support those as well? And I'll just note I am seeing a lot of questions already in the Q&A, so thank you so much. I'm going to answer these kind of at the end, and will interrupt me if there's something that needs to be interrupted. Thanks. Okay, so now that you've done all of that immense amount of work to get sort of the homework done, it's now sort of the time to do the evaluation and the shortlisting. And so here's where you, I think, can really start to research those LIMS options. You've probably done a little bit of this sort of already before this, but reaching out to people and getting demos and coming up with, the many hundreds of LIMS vendors out there to, the handful of vendors that seem like they're going to work for your needs. And so one thing that I think could really help is sort of, after you've gathered these pain points, thinking about what are the things I'm going to be Googling or looking for when I'm searching for vendors. And so if you have pain points around sample tracking or data entry errors, terms that you might be looking for is around automated sample tracking or barcoding or RFIDs, as well as data entry validation. And so that will sort of help with that manual sample tracking piece of it. Slowing the process and slow processing and workflow bottlenecks. Terms that you're going to be looking for is workflow automation, task assignment, alerting, things like that will help you identify if that solution is going to be right for you. If you have issues with compliance or auditing, looking for audit trails, chain of custody, electronic signatures, compliance reporting, all of those are going to be terms that LIMS vendors will use to help address some of those pain points. If you're struggling with sort of limited access to real-time data, if you're getting calls or texts from your boss at night asking you where data is, then something like a centralized data repository is probably what you're looking for, or company-wide or lab-wide dashboards. If you're struggling with instrument and system integration issues, so your instrument data is really disparate, you can't uh, you can't find it very easily, or things are getting lost in that process of analysis, making sure that the LIMS has the direct instrument data capture and other external system integrations, other things like ELN integration or an ELN as part of it, analytics tools, databases. Those are going to be sort of the keywords to search for. Challenges with inventory shortages and sort of mismanagement there, you're going to be looking for a tool that has that consumable and reagent inventory tracking. Inconsistent reporting and analysis, making sure that you have sort of customizable reports, analytics, automated results notifications will help with some of those as well. And then lastly, kind of those scalability and security concerns, making sure that there are things like configurable workflows or role-based access. Um, Terms like scalable architecture will also help, especially if you're dealing with a lot of large data in your lab. And so here we'll kind of ask, what are the challenges that you're experiencing that you think a LIMS could help solve? We're going to do kind of a deep dive into each of these sections. And so this might help me determine, what we spend more time on versus less in a minute here. So it looks like a lot of folks are kind of answering around slow processing, workflow bottlenecks, and instrument and systems integrations, but it's a pretty even spread. So that's helpful to know. I will kind of keep that in mind as we jump in. And again, this is recorded and the slides are going to be shared afterwards. So, if we kind of skip over some of these things, you'll get that later as well. Okay. So if you're struggling with sort of that sample and material management, there's a lot of different tools out there, including LIMS, that can help with this. And so what you may want to think about as you're doing this is the system able to track the lineage of the samples as they're processed? Is it also able to connect them with experimental results and analyses? Or is it pretty disparate? Or in some case, LIMS solutions will offer kind of a sample management solution on the side that's not fully integrated with the rest of the LIMS. And so making sure that you're able to do that to understand that sample holistically, to get that full traceability, the flexibility in the sample tracking, or if the vendor is offering specific handling of the samples or materials that you're using, that handling is actually aligned with what you're doing within your lab as well. Making sure that the system has a way to capture the locations of these things that you're managing within the lab, and also making sure that you have kind of that foresight to think about what the samples or materials you may have today versus, next year or in the next several years. When you're looking for a LIMS to help with data management, it's probably a little bit old for me to say here now. We're looking for fair data practices. And so if you haven't heard of FAIR before, it is sort of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible data practices. And so this allows you to follow some guidelines to help understand, can I easily find this data? Is it accessible to the people that need to access it? So, accessible doesn't mean accessible to everybody, but certainly within sort of the folks that should be accessing it have access. That's readily available. You're not having to walk to some single lab computer to access data. It's a little bit more accessible than that. It's interoperable. So when you are using that data, if you are sharing it with collaborators or sharing it for submissions or even sharing it publicly, is it formatted in a way that allows people to use it, maybe let's say in Excel or in downstream analytics applications or things like that if it's going to a central repository. And then also if it's reproducible. So of course, if you are able to reproduce that data, that's one of the pinnacles of scientific experimentation. And so you want to make sure that you are able to sort of reproduce that data as well. Making sure that you can standardize and connect and integrate, organize and audit all of this data. So really, as part of having all of your data management, there are pieces that you can look for when you're looking for standardization. So things like templates or automatic kind of data validation or integrity checks. If you need ways of organizing your data in folders or experimentation or notebooks, that the vendor is sort of offering that. And then, of course, that auditing piece as well. Does the data management piece of the software also help enforce structure for consistent usage? Or is it very unstructured, which may suit your lab just as well? Making sure that you can also import results that are from instruments that help with sample management or QC analysis and reporting. And then, of course, that automatic processing of data. So if you need data to be transformed, or if you need calculations to be performed, kind of moving people out of manual tools and putting it into a LIMS can also really help with that holistic data management. If you're looking for kind of workflow and collaboration needs, some things to think about here in terms of what vendors may offer is around, standardizing and managing those processes. Like how does the LIMS do that? How are you able to monitor work that's underway? Is that something that there are nice dashboards on, or alerts, or capacity queries, things like that? Can the tool assist with handoff and notification between operations? And that really helps smooth out the work where, people aren't having to log in to see what they're doing. They get that automatic notification that work is up for them. Are you able to document experiments and capture those associated results as part of this? Or is that, having to be in a different system as well? And can you create and display those reports that might be needed within the laboratory? If you're looking for smoothing out analyses or accelerating that process at all, um, things to look at from vendors are the ability to sort of easily visualize and analyze those results using either tools that the vendor has, or if it integrates with other analytic tools. The ability to sort of analyze data across experiments and not just, looking at that one Excel file, but effectively, what do our experiments look over time? Can we see trends? Are we able to identify outliers or problems with machines? Things like that. And then lastly, if you need sort of tailored analyses for those LIMS, this will often be sort of utilized as the term specialized LIMS. And so do you need a specialized LIMS for antibody discovery, for example, or do you need sort of that certificate of analysis generation as part of that? So having those documented to sort of align with vendors will help as well. If security is sort of on the list of things to improve, thinking about where the data is housed, and what is required by your organization potentially, um, is important. Is that going to be sort of on premise? Is that going to be a local machine that has all of this data, or is it okay to be in the cloud? If it is in the cloud, what type of cloud? Can it be multi-tenant? Does it have to be private? If you don't know the answers to that, your IT folks probably will. So definitely that's, a good thing to sort of level set with them. Looking at what are the different options for authentication. So can you have sort of single sign-on, so you're signed into the entire system at once, or two-factor authentication, which is very common now, or other types of authentication that, again, your IT organization may require. Any sort of data partitioning that's needed. So if you are looking to, let's say, manage clinical study data across multiple studies, it's very likely that those studies will need to be partitioned in a way that each person that has sort of IRB approval to look at that data has access without having access to the other study data. The ability to lock electronic notebooks or any other data, and then also any sort of compliance features that may be required, such as comments on sort of data update or delete, or making sure that it's auditing the things that are required by your regulatory body as well. Okay, so that was a lot of kind of that evaluation and shortlisting. And the last piece I think is really sort of broken up into two phases where once you've decided what that short list of vendors is, it's very important and really something that I would advocate for to get that in-depth evaluation and make sure that you're really getting hands-on experience with the vendor before you decide to purchase. And then you can get sort of more custom demos and work to evaluate the vendors. But that selection process should really come after, everybody's gotten their feet wet, essentially. And so some tips that we've collected over the years of doing sort of software trials with people is making sure that you're testing real world scenarios, right? So your vendor should help be able to provide you with this. Making sure that you're evaluating how user friendly it is, especially if that's something that's important to you to get adopted quickly or implemented quickly. Making sure if you've got sort of folks that are having a hard time with a change, if it's very easy to use, it tends to sort of reduce that activation energy quite a bit. Making sure that you're able to customize it the way that you need, as well as what the system will look like as it scales. So having a good understanding of, how many samples you may have in the freezer today versus how many you may have next year can be helpful in sort of working with the vendor to make sure that it's going to scale to those needs. And also making sure that you can integrate with the tools that you need to integrate with that have been sort of identified in those previous steps. Making sure you're sort of reviewing the data management and security pieces of it, talking to the vendor about how backups are managed or how you will manage backups with your IT team, making sure that it also has the necessary security measures that your lab may need. Making sure you're asking other people and seeing if they have positive or negative feedback about the vendor as well. And then lastly, you can get sort of an extended trial if you need to, and vendors will often have different timelines for that. But it's much more important to make that well-informed decision than sort of a rushed decision in this sense. So as you've gotten through that, the other piece of this is making sure that you're choosing the right vendor for your lab. And the sales process can often be sort of that early indicator of what the experience with the software is going to be like as a whole. Oftentimes we hear people come to us because they really struggled with communication from the vendor, getting support, or really felt like they weren't getting any support. And so knowing kind of what your rules are or what you need for that, and making sure that that vendor is going to fulfill it. But other things to think about is sort of what is their experience in the LIMS space like? What is their experience in scientific data management versus your specific area of science? What does their sort of partnership and support look like, and how committed are they to being able to help you get up and running? Additional things is to think about like implementation costs and other sort of fees that might come with that support as well. What are the pricing structures and then those additional costs? And is the vendor sort of clearly showing that scientific competence that you need to be able to support you and your lab as you start to get implemented? And then the last thing, of course, I think with sort of any human interaction is how are they treating you, right? And if you are able to assess that positively versus negatively, that may have some indication of, what your relationship will look like long term. And so I've got the last poll here around what is the most important factor for you when choosing limbs. And we've intentionally sort of omitted the making sure that it fits all your requirements because that is definitely the most important thing on this list. If it's a great vendor and they have a great price and it works perfectly with everything else, but it doesn't actually fulfill your requirements, it's not going to be a good LIMS for you. And so curious to see kind of what other people here see. And it looks like kind of a mixed bag, right? Like a ease of use, configurability and flexibility is another one, right? There are no two labs the same. I've learned this in both my experience as a bench scientist and also working with different labs at LabKey. So making sure that you can configure a system to work for your needs is super, super important. And that ease of use and user experience, I think, also is really important because if people can't use it, if you can't adapt it, if you can't sort of make changes overall, it's really, it might last for a year or two, but then ultimately people will be looking for an easier solution. So totally kind of understand that and see that. Okay, we're at the last sort of stage here. If you've hung in with me this far, congratulations. And really, we're at sort of that decision-making criteria. So things to think about. I think in addition to making sure that the LIMS vendor is going to fulfill your requirements, that's going to be the most critical thing. Thinking about reviewing that trial feedback. So after you've sort of done that in-depth trial, hopefully it's not just you, but a couple people in the lab and they've gotten a sense of this. People will have kind of gut feelings about how this may work for them. And so making sure that you're incorporating that into the decision-making process. That user acceptance, I think, is sort of an indicator to how the trial went. Will sort of the users accept this as your chosen software as well? The total cost of ownership is going to be really important to the fees, any sort of custom work that needs to be done, any implementation, support, things like that. What does that look like and does it fit the budget that you have? The vendor support and culture, obviously, as well as sort of that scalability and future proofing. So making sure that this is going to last for several years to come in your lab and really be supportive of that work. You can also sort of consider what the product roadmaps are. Are people actively developing on the software and are they able to share those roadmaps with you? And then, of course, what are those legal and contractual terms, which may not be anybody on this webinar, but certainly will happen during that process as well. Oh, and let me share this. And then I think we add here, like making sure that it is configurable and flexible. And then also you have sort of that ease of use and good user experience for people to be able to use it. Okay, so if you've gotten this far, you may be wondering, what does LabKey have to do with any of this? Well, we have LIMS, and many people will come to us looking for data management solutions around sort of LIMS adjacent. And so last year, we actually launched our very first LIMS product. And it's really designed to help optimize those laboratory workflows for that maximum sort of productivity efficiency gains. So making sure that you're able to put work into workflows and get notifications and be able to see kind of what that work is like over time and manage it, making sure that it is really easy to use. So again, as sort of somebody who's been in the lab before, if it's not easy to use, it's basically useless. And so making sure that we're able to create a LIMS product that people can use and adapt and change and quickly ramp up on has been very, very important to us. And then making sure that we're also doing the pieces that are sort of driving that decision making. So having assay data management and electronic lab notebooks and reporting and visualizations and sample management all within a centralized system will really help make those decisions much faster within the lab. And then, of course, with all of the underpinnings of being secure and compliant, and making sure that it sort of follows those security and other regulations that your lab may need. And so if you're interested in talking to us about LabKey's LIMS, if you are interested in just talking about a LIMS and like unsure where to start, feel free to schedule a meeting with us, and it'll likely be me or someone else on the team really chatting with you about this and seeing how we can help. And then of course, we'll be sharing these slides and recording and sort of the demo link after the call as well. Okay, let's get into questions. There's a lot here, so I'm just gonna quickly sort of look at these. Oh, I really like this question. So what do we do if no limbs is a perfect fit and they're all expensive? I think this is a very common feeling that people have. And this is where that gathering requirement section becomes so important and so vital because there is not ever going to be a LIMS that is a 100% fit. If there is, let me know. I would be fascinated to hear. But ultimately, there's the most high priority things that you put on your gathering requirements list should be able to be solved with the LIMS. And so really making sure that you have a very curated list of what those high priority items are and the must-haves that are in there are really going to be important in helping you evaluate if the LIMS is going to be the right fit for you. Also thinking about that customization or configurability. Maybe the LIMS is an 80% fit for what you need, and there's a 20% gap that you can either fund or develop yourself to sort of implement that last 10 or 20%. And if they're all expensive, yes, that is true. LIMS are typically not cheap, although I will say there is becoming a much more aware uh, uh, thought process, I would say, among vendors where they're trying to offer, us included, trying to offer less expensive options for groups that may not have the budget yet. So for things like LabKey, we offer sort of smaller sample management solutions prior to our LIMS. And so if you don't have the budget, you can start with sort of that high priority sample management solution and then move into the LIMS as you can afford to, as well as kind of moving into those necessary, maybe medium priority needs for LIMS as well. What are some other questions here? Yeah, so in LIMS is a broad term. They're the high-end LIMS in the market that are super expensive, or the very low-end ones that are too good to be truly an effective LIMS. I think so the person is asking kind of where is LabKey on that scale. I think that again, there's very uh, established vendors that have been out there for 20, 30 years that are very, very large, and when we look at that history of what LIMS is, who was purchasing LIMS 30 years ago is very different than who's purchasing LIMS today. And so making sure that you have a vendor that's very aware of what the demand looks like, as well as making sure that you're trying out the software. So if you're testing out kind of those um, uh, lightweight LIMS, making sure that it fits your requirements. And if it fits your requirements and you feel like it has the right fit, then it doesn't really matter kind of, where, if it's the well-established versus sort of the lightweight LIMS, where it is on that scale. LabKey, frankly, has all of those options, and so that's what makes us very unique as well, is you can really come in at any entry point, depending on where you're at. Everyone just wants to keep using Excel for everything. They don't perceive the challenges with that. What can I do? That's a hard one. However, I will say a lot of my time spent at LabKey has been working with people that have been trying to come up with solutions outside of Excel for their lab. And oftentimes what we do is realize benefit quickly. So let's say somebody is adamant on managing samples within an Excel file and is spending maybe 4 to 10 hours a week searching for those samples for experiments. Making sure that you can show the value add of if you manage these samples within a tool like LabKey or a LIMS or a different LIMS, maybe that cuts the work time from 2 to 10 hours or whatever it is to 5 minutes of finding samples. And so really making sure that the benefits are realized quickly, especially for people that are having a hard time transitioning out of sort of traditional systems. Um, how does LIMS help with sample management? What about physical inventory management, as in what the freezer and what rack box? Yeah, so I think that there's kind of there are LIMS that have sample management tools built in to their LIMS, such as the LabKey LIMS. But there are other LIMS that really don't focus on sample management. And actually, we've had people come to us because they're using a LIMS and it doesn't have sample management. And so they're coming to us for that sample management piece. So I do think that making sure that the vendor that you're looking at has what you need. And so if you need sort of physical management of those samples, does it have the, visual of your freezer? Is it able to extract the location of a sample very quickly? Can you move those boxes or racks around as well are sort of important things. So I think that's kind of that, homework piece of the due diligence you want to do is making sure that it has that. And as a follow-up, making sure it has it on the website, but then as you're doing your evaluation, making sure it's there as well. Okay, we've got yeah, what maybe the last question here that I'll say is sort of some vendors offer incremental support contracts alongside their software subscriptions. What does LabKey offer by comparison? So we actually are so confident in our product as well as our support and really don't want to add, extra support costs on things, that all of our support and implementation and training is built into the cost of our software. And so that's something to really think about as you're looking at other vendors as well, is how do they charge for this and what does that look like? Is there a time limit or a period in which they'll support you for free versus getting that ongoing training and maintenance support as you need to? Okay. There's some other questions here. We'll make sure to answer them over email. But thank you everyone so much for joining today. I hope you learned something. I definitely learned something too, so I appreciate it and take care.